the cloud. Welcome, my name is Alexandra Schneider, and I am the director of the Burke County Public Libraries located in Wellsburg and Follansbee, which for those of you who may not be local are located in the northern panhandle of West Virginia. If you would not mind, take a second and enter where you're from and how many people are watching with you in the chat section. If you are watching this recording, then leave some commentary with some of your feedback as well. We also thank you for joining us during the difficult time. In-house programming and virtual programming is kind of something that we are still doing jointly, but we're also trying to bring people back into the library and still continue a virtual presence. So a few house rules before we get started. No recording of this individual author book talk that we are doing. If there is anything that you need from it or would like to use the video recording as well, please contact the Burke County Public Libraries. Please be respectful in commentary and anything that you do leave. Construction criticism is always, well receptive. However, we just want it to be a safe environment for the author and anybody else in the future that is watching this. Please share your thoughts and opinions in any of the commentary because we do want them. You'll be muted if you do join us the entire time. However, you'll be able to do some live Q&A with us at the end of the session. And if you are a little bit behind the times and you watch us when we've already concluded this, then no biggie. Leave some of your comments and we will try to get it to the author to do it. So I keep stressing, leave your thoughts and comments in the commentary. If you're experiencing any glitching while you're joining us today, consider turning your video off, coming back in. I will be monitoring to let people in and out of the meeting at this point in time, but try to do a few things to see if you can get back on. And if not, it will be recorded so that you can watch it at a later time. If you're watching from a computer, consider doing a few different things as well. Your bandwidth might be a little bit slow, especially for some of the virtual recordings. So if the library can help you at any point in time access our future recording, let us know. This will also be an audio version on our Dallas story come July. Only downfall, obviously, with Dallas stories, you can't visually see what the author may or may not be sharing with us today, but you'll at least be able to listen to it. And also, we ask you to bear with us. Technical difficulties always happen. It doesn't seem like it ever goes smoothly at times. So anything, that becomes a glitch on our side, just bear with us and we'll get back to the regular scheduled program. And lastly, always be respectful, again, in the commentary that you leave and any comments you do live with us. Again, safe space for both you, the audience, and the person that is our author today. So today our format is going to be as follows. The intro that we're doing now, the author presentation, and then a little bit of Q&A afterwards to wrap up our book talk. So today I am going to introduce you to Fred Leavitt. He wrote the book, If Ignorance is Bliss, We Should All Be Ecstatic. And thank you, Fred, for joining us today. We appreciate you. And we had a little bit of a rocky start at first, but technical difficulties we got through.
You got through. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, we had a little bit of difficulties with your PowerPoint, so I am sharing it for you. So at a point in time that you need me to move to the next slide, just let me know and I'll page on through for you.
Great. Okay, should I start?
Yep, you can talk or start.
Well, when I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan, I took some courses in the medical school. And one of the courses was pharmacology. And I became convinced because of my instructors that drugs would be developed within the next decade or so that would essentially prevent or cure all human diseases. I graduated, I started teaching, and I got involved in pharmacology. And I learned, much to my distress, that an enormous amount of the pharmacological literature was incorrect. There were errors, there were lies, there were literally more than 100,000 deaths that would have been prevented if the drug companies had been honest. So I began writing about that. And then I thought, well, it's not just the drug companies, it's probably other businesses as well. So I looked into other businesses and I found, yes, they weren't trustworthy either. So I got interested in finding trustworthy knowledge. And I came to the very depressing conclusion that there's no trustworthy knowledge. We can't really know anything. And that's what this talk is about. Socrates was famous in part for saying that a friend of him told him that the oracle at Delphi had said that Socrates was the smartest man in Greece. And Socrates thought the oracle must be wrong. So he began questioning supposedly smart people. And he found that they really didn't know anything. They just thought they were smart. Turns out Socrates went beyond what he could have known also. So anyway, today I'm going to try to convince you through reason that reason, among other things, can't be trusted. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Or can I do it, or? Okay, so the philosopher G.E. Moore said that the radical skeptical position, and that's the position that no knowledge is possible, he said that's ridiculous. And he gave an example. Suppose a philosopher says, my hands and my body don't really exist. Well, G.E. Moore says, that's crazy. Of course my hands exist. It's obvious. It's much more obvious than anything that the skeptic says. Well, in fact, the very example that he gave turned out to be a bad one, because many people who've had limbs amputated still experience pain in those phantom limbs. It's as though they do exist, even though they're not there. Okay, next slide, please. So just to show where I am in all this, I imagined a hypothetical experiment. Let's suppose we have a perfect lie detector. It always can tell whether or not a person is telling the truth. And I'm the subject. And it, excuse me, it asks me, do you believe that the sun will rise tomorrow and your friends will act normally and a piece of strawberry shortcake will taste good and so on? I would say, yes, I believe all that. And the machine would indicate that I'm telling the truth. And then if the next question to me was, do you believe in radical skepticism, that we can never know anything at all? I would say, yes, I do believe that. And again, the machine would say that I'm telling the truth. Well, those two things are incompatible. It presents a real paradox, and I don't have the answer to that. If any of you do, please write me, let me know. Okay, next, please. So I already mentioned this, that I wrote a book called The Real Drug Abusers, and I gave many, many examples of fraud, false claims, kickbacks to doctors. You know, even though the drug that we manufacture isn't the best, if you prescribe it, we'll give you money. There have been several studies in which two drugs are compared, two related drugs, and in 98% of the cases, the company that sponsored the drug has its drug coming out favorably. If I haven't made that clear, let me try it again. Suppose you have drugs A and B, A manufactured by company A, B by company B, and you compare them. They each company does a study. Well, A's company will have drug A coming out better, B's company will have drug B coming out better, almost always. There's a very respected MD, PhD, John Ioannidis, who wrote 2 articles several years ago that are just incredible. He said that because of all the dishonesty, not just in the drug literature, but in the medical literature overall, he argued that more than half of the conclusions in the best medical journals are incorrect. That's an amazing thing to think about. More than half the conclusions are incorrect. Okay, next slide, please. So, as one kind of example, a relatively recent study, in the last 15 years, there have been 396 cases where the treatment that was being prescribed that the literature had indicated was the best treatment turned out not to be a good treatment. 396 cases in the last 15 years. That's a lot. Okay, next. So it's not true that I don't know anything. I know that I know nothing. I also know that I exist, and I know about certain bodily sensations. I know if I have a headache. But as far as I'm concerned, that's all that we can know. Just those 3 things. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show the different possible ways we can know, and then I'll show why each of them is not trustworthy. So the first way is awareness of bodily states, and that I just got through saying is trustworthy. If you tell me you have a headache, maybe I don't trust you, but you know if you have a headache. You can't fool yourself about that. So awareness of bodily states, that's trustworthy. Next comes innate knowledge. Next slide, please. So certain beliefs come before all experience, like we all believe every event has a cause, and even newborn babies respond as though they believe that. But the issue is not how we think we know. The issue is whether or not our beliefs are correct. So I'll explain in a second. Next slide, please. Konrad Lorenz is famous for doing studies with ducklings, where as soon as they were born, he would start walking, or in this case, she, and they would follow him. Now, the ducklings have innate knowledge. They have to follow their mother in order to survive. So as soon as their mother starts walking, they follow. But Konrad Lorenz and others showed that the innate knowledge may be wrong. So if it's not the mother, but a woman, the ducklings will follow her. In that case, they have innate knowledge, follow the first thing you see that's moving, but it's not correct in this case. They shouldn't be following a woman. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we come to knowledge through faith. And this is a very touchy thing, so I'm not really going to say much about it. In my book, I say a lot about it. And if you want, you can follow up. But I have a few sayings here. I assume you can all see the PowerPoint, so you can just read it. And if knowledge was really solid, we wouldn't have differences in beliefs depending on where a person was born. Okay, next slide, please. So I tell a story in here. I went to school for 2 years in New Mexico, Eastern New Mexico University. And I took a course there in philosophy. It was taught by the Methodist minister. And I was a troublemaker. I would try to stir things up. So at one point, I told an anecdote. Thomas Huxley, who was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, got into a debate with a theologian. And the theologian said, "You philosophers, you're like a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there." And I thought that's a great description of what many philosophers do. But then Huxley came back with a beautiful answer. He said, "You're right," to the theologian, "but you would have found the cat." And I thought that was funny. I told that to the class and everyone stared at me. They didn't get it. And they said, "Isn't it better to find the cat?" But the cat isn't there, but it's still better to find it. So that sums up to me what a lot of religion is, that you see a black cat even though it isn't there. Okay, next slide, please. The people who try to persuade others to have faith in religion make a lot of money. It's a big business, and some people are extremely successful. Okay, next. All right, so now we come to reasoning as a way of gaining knowledge. And the philosopher Agrippa, who lived around the time of Socrates, probably, maybe a little later, he said that every logical argument, every one, has at least one of 3 fallacies. So let's suppose you say that X is true. Well, how do you know that X is true? Because Y supports X and shows that X is true. Well, how do you know that Y is true? Well, because W supports Y, and so on. You never get to the end. Next, a logical argument might have uncertain assumptions. And so philosophers have been trying to look for something that we can say is absolutely true. So some beliefs are self-evident, and they give the example 2 + 2 = 4. How can you dispute that? Well, I will dispute it later. But even if we assume it's true, how do we get from that to complex forms of knowledge? And we can't. And then finally, logical arguments may commit the fallacy of circularity. So A explains B, B explains C, and C explains A. Not good enough, doesn't work. Okay, next. I looked at results in the Supreme Court. Now you'd think that the Supreme Court is made up of brilliant individuals, seasoned lawyers who have had years of practice in evaluating logical arguments. And yet, we know that, to go back a few years, with many arguments, before we ever even heard the arguments, we knew that Scalia would vote in one way and Ginsburg would vote in the opposite way. So the arguments didn't make any difference. It's what people came in with their beliefs. Okay, next. And by the way, Alexandra, I'm happy to pause if anyone cares to have any questions. Okay, I'll go on. So next, the idea of induction. Induction means generalizing from the known to the unknown. So how do we know that the sun's going to come up tomorrow? Well, it's always come up. How do we know that our friend is going to be friendly? Well, she's always been friendly. We're generalizing. Well, Bertrand Russell gave an example of a chicken, which was also a very smart philosopher. And every day, the chicken's owner came and fed it. And the chicken had the idea, it believed in induction, hey, every day this farmer is going to come and feed me. And then Thanksgiving came around and the farmer came out and the chicken thought, oh, it's going to feed me. But in fact, the chicken wound up as the dinner. So Bertrand Russell says there's no reason has been shown for trusting induction. Just because something has happened 1,000 times, 1 billion times in the past does not mean it'll happen again. Nelson Goodman made it even more interesting. He said, well, Russell gave an example of the chicken, or the example of the sun coming up, but in fact, we never know what the true induction is. So let's suppose you say all emeralds are green. Every emerald you've ever seen has been green. So the next emerald we see should also be green. That's the typical induction. Well, Nelson Goodman said, no, it's not that simple. Suppose I say, I believe in a law that says every emerald is green until May 19th, 2022. And then from then on, every emerald will be blue. So you pick up a new emerald and you say, see, it's green. I told you all emeralds are green. And I say, that's exactly what I was saying. It's green now, but tomorrow, and any emerald you see will be blue. And Nelson Goodman argued, how do we distinguish between those two? We really can't. Okay, next slide, please. Alexandra, you looked like that was unclear. Did you follow that? Okay, great. So induction can't be shown to be reliable. Well, deduction also can't be shown to be reliable. The only way to prove deduction is to use deduction. Like all A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C. That's deduction, but it can't be proven. And in fact, people who are not logicians might think that all logicians have the same criteria for what constitutes a proof. But in fact, that's not at all true. Even the very seemingly obvious ones are disputed by many logicians. Next slide, please. Okay, next, you might think that we see the world generally the way the world really is. Natural selection leads us to that. If you see the world imperfectly, you might not realize that that large animal coming toward you is a predator. You might stay there. Those of us who can see the world most clearly will do the best. Next slide, please. Well, that's not true. One reason, I'm blocking on the person's name who wrote all this. I like to give credit where I can, but I can't, sorry. In any case, natural selection may have limited options. Whoops. The overall effects of a gene may be positive, but it may have some negative consequences. So for example, and this has been shown in many cases, some genes will make a person more attractive when the person's of reproductive age, whether physically more attractive or maybe more attractive for health reasons or whatever. But at the same time, that gene may have some negative effects. It may make the person more susceptible to diseases when the person is past reproductive age. So natural selection won't always work. And the important thing is that natural selection acts on characteristics that affect reproductive potential, not truth. So I give an example. Let's suppose that you put a 1 foot wide plank connected between two very tall buildings. So you have a plank 100 feet long and 1 foot wide connected to two buildings. And you have to walk across that plank from one building to the other. Well, there's a very good chance that you won't make it. Sorry about that. However, let's suppose the plank was on the ground and you had to walk that 100 feet. You'd have no trouble. It would be an easy thing to do. Now let's get the plank back on top of the buildings. And suppose I hypnotize you and persuade you that the plank is now on the ground. Well, you'd probably be able to do it. So if you saw the world incorrectly, if you saw the plank that was way, way up high, but you thought it was on the ground, you would have done much better than if you knew the truth about it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here's an example of less than optimal reasoning, and I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. I'm going to get some water while you're struggling to get the wrong answer. Okay, and the answer, next slide, please. The answer is A. Could you go back to the previous slide? Okay, so Jack is looking at Anne. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through this now. You have to trust me that the correct answer is A. Now, 2 slides from now. Okay, here's another example of these. I hope are fun examples, but they also show that our reasoning capacity is very limited. So I hope you all had time to look at that one. And let's go to the next slide. Now here, this is an example from the philosopher Piaget. You have a beaker and you pour it from one to the other. So all the water is poured from one to the other. And then he asks a young child, which beaker has more water? And the young child typically says the taller one. Well, that's incorrect. They're exactly the same in amount of water. So Piaget argues that most people eventually outgrow this thinking. children outgrow it at around age 6 or 7. But why do we assume that all of us have outgrown illogical thinking? Isn't there the possibility that there is reasoning a lot more complicated than this one that we just don't get? Okay, next slide, please. Here's an example that shows that we may not have even outgrown the one with the young child. So experienced bartenders get it incorrect. They make the same kind of mistake that Piaget's children make. Okay, next slide, please. It's an interesting example here. I'm a big basketball fan, so I watch the basketball playoffs, and I often listen to pundits making predictions. And they're wrong as often as right. Philip Tetlock gave an example. He worked with 284 people who were leaders in their field, people who were on television making predictions, newspaper columnists, and so on. And he asked them to assess the probabilities of certain events. And they made, between the 284 of them, they made over 82,000 predictions about what would happen in the next 20 years. And they actually did a little bit worse than chance. That's pretty remarkable. But next time you get someone who tells you that someone is a shoo-in to be elected or a shoo-in to win a golf tournament or whatever, just recognize that these people are wrong at least as often as they're right. Okay, next slide. Here's another example. I made up some syllogisms, and you can look at these, and there are 2 more. I couldn't get them all on one page. But what I ask you is, are these syllogisms valid? And by that I mean, if you accept the first 2 premises, the first 2 sentences are premises, let's assume that they're correct. Let's assume there's no dispute about that, they're correct. Is the conclusion correct? So read those, I'll give you a minute, and then I'll show you the next 2. You didn't expect that you were going to have to work today, did you? Okay, next slide, whenever you're ready. And the answers are, the first 4 syllogisms, the one on the previous page, are incorrect. The 2 you're looking at now are correct. They're valid. If you accept the premises, you accept the conclusion. Okay, next slide, please. So again, really, we think that some are valid or invalid, but that might only be because of our limited experience, our limited ability to think of counterexamples. Next slide. I think that's an interesting quote. Next slide. Okay, I gave some more. And what I want to show here, all of these syllogisms are valid. However, people start with different premises. People don't agree. Let me take the abortion example. So one person says, my preacher conveys the word of God. My preacher says abortion is wrong, therefore abortion is wrong. That's a valid argument. The conclusion, abortion is wrong. But the next one is also a valid argument. Women have the right to control what happens inside their bodies. A developing fetus affects a woman's body. Therefore, a woman has a right to abort a developing fetus. So Adam and Beth may never come to any agreement because they're starting with different premises. And that's true of all of the examples given here. All of them are valid arguments, but obviously the conclusions differ. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we come to empiricism. The belief that everything we know comes through observations and inferences from them. So the first point I make is that empiricism itself, the claim that all knowledge is gained through the senses, is not a claim that's gained through the senses. So there's a bit of knowledge that empiricists claim, but it's not empirical. Well, how many of you who are listening to this were there when the Magna Carta was signed? I'll bet none of you. How many of you were there when dinosaurs roamed the earth? I'll bet none of you. So the observations and inferences are often secondhand, third hand, 10th hand. We have to be very careful about them. Next slide, please. So Gilbert Ryle and John Austin are two eminent philosophers, but I think they make an argument that is ridiculous. They say, sure, some people have illusions and delusions. We do make occasional errors. We do have mirages, but we can detect them eventually. So that shows the general trustworthiness of our senses. And I think that's ridiculous. I wish we had time to really argue about this, but the idea that we can detect some does not imply to me that we detect all of them. There may be many illusions and delusions that we all have that can never be detected. Next slide. This example fascinates me. So in 1986, the Challenger spacecraft exploded, killing everyone on board. And that made headlines in the newspapers and television and so on for several days afterwards. So there was a psychology class, and the teacher in the class decided to do an experiment. So he asked everybody in class to write down where they were and what they were doing when they first heard the news about the Challenger. So they did that. He was teaching at a fairly small college, so he was able to keep in touch with all of the students. And he wrote them 2 years later, and he asked them the same questions. Where were you? What were you doing when you heard the news? And look at the difference in the answers. About half the students gave different answers in 1986 and 1988. What a difference. And what it says is we really can't trust our memories. And I'll give another example, this one again from Piaget, but this is from Piaget himself. He said when he was a baby, his nanny took him in a pram. They went for a stroll, and they were accosted by a man who tried to kidnap baby Piaget. And the nanny was able to fight him off, though she was scratched up. She received a few wounds in the process, but she was very heroic. Piaget had that memory throughout his childhood. It was very vivid. He remembered being in the pram, the man coming, trying to grab him, and so on. When Piaget was about 16 or so, a package was delivered to his house and to his parents. And in it was a gold watch and a note. The package came from his nanny, and the note said, "I am returning this wonderful gold watch that you gave me as a present for saving little John. In fact, it never happened. I made the whole thing up. I wanted to look good in your eyes, so I made it up. I've been feeling guilty all these years." And yet Piaget remembered it vividly. So our memories just can't be trusted. Okay, next slide. Here, this is a great one. I hope all of you copy down this site and give it a try, comparing your memory with that of a chimpanzee. And before you do it, if any of you care to bet with me, I'll be happy to bet with you. I'm betting on the chimpanzee to have a better memory than you. Okay, next slide. So what Immanuel Kant and others argued is that we never experience external reality. We experience only things that are filtered through our senses. And you and I, if we have different sensory abilities, may experience different things. Alexandra, excuse me, I don't have a record of how many slides I have, so I'm not sure how far I should go. I have a lot more slides. I'm happy to keep going, but if you want to pause or anything, however you want to do it.
You are on slide 34 out of 70, and I would say you have about, we've been going for about a half hour, so you have about another half hour to keep it under an hour program.
Okay, that sounds good. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, okay, right. So we tend to think of mathematics as precise. And this is also, this slide, I'll explain what it's about, but it's also about induction. What scientists try to do, the whole scientific enterprise, is relating different variables. So let's say, if I had labeled it properly, I'm sorry I didn't, this would be X, this would be Y. And the idea, oh, you couldn't even see that, or maybe you could, I don't know. When X is 1, Y is 2.000, and when X is 2, Y is 3.000, and so on. What is Y when X is 4? And there's a very obvious answer. Y is 5.0000. Well, I'm not a mathematician, but I spent one long weekend trying to develop equations that had when X is 1, Y is 2, when X is 2, Y is 3, and so on. But when X is 4, Y is not 5.0000. Next slide, please. So I gave 2 examples. This equation, if you want to be as ridiculous as I was and actually try to do it, you'll see when X is 1 here, Y is 2.0000. Same here. When X is 2, again. But when X is 4, you get very different values. So we can't trust it even when there's an equation like F equals MA, E equals MC squared. Those are kind of the pinnacles of scientific achievement. to summarize a lot of what we know in an equation. But what I argue is that for any set of values, and I'm going to say this twice, for any set of values, there are an infinite number of equations that meet the criteria. Next slide, please. And then I really put my mathematical abilities to a test. It was a very long, painful weekend. And I said, okay, let's say when X is 1, Y is 2, when X is 2, Y is 3, but let's make up a number for when X is 4. And I arbitrarily picked a number. I could have picked any number at all. I picked when X is 3, Y is -10. And then bizarrely, when X is 4, Y goes back to being positive, Y is 5. Can I find an equation where these work and yet there are other equations as well? Next slide, please. Again, if you want to try it, try that equation and you'll see that it works. So this is my conclusion. For any prediction or explanation about anything, there are an infinite number of conceivable alternatives. That statement, I think. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, what do you see in there? Well, some people will see the word good. Other people see the word evil. I hope you can both see both if you take enough time. And the point is that some people will see only one. So even though you and I are both presented with the same stimulus, you'll surely see good and I'll surely see evil. We really don't see the same thing. Just presenting two people with the same thing does not mean that they will perceive the same thing. Okay, next slide, please. So knowledge that comes from other sources. I'm sitting in a place where my iPad is getting hot because there's a lot of sun, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Hope you don't mind. So how about the knowledge that we get from other sources? That knowledge may be incorrect because of unintentional error. I started by talking about the drug companies and other companies, and often the error is intentional. Next slide, please. So there are many motives to deceive. Unfortunately, in the history of humans, there have been many, many examples. But here's an interesting example. So the biologist Roger Sperry did a study where he removed the eyes of frogs, rotated them 180 degrees and put them back in their sockets. Now, in the case of frogs, the eyes can be regenerated. So if Sperry waited long enough and the nerves connected again to each other, if he put the eyes back in their normal position, the frogs had normal vision. But when he rotated them, if a fly was put above the frog's eye and to one side, the frog's tongue would go down there. And that shows that even seemingly direct perceptions are fallible. Just because we think we see something doesn't mean that we saw accurately. Anyway, one motive to deceive is simple curiosity. Sperry deceived the frogs because he was curious about what would happen. I give a lot of examples in the book that I advise readers not to even bother with if they have weak stomachs, because they're horrible. But they occurred in the US. Many of them occurred within the last 50 years. I'll let you read that one. If you want to see a lot of other examples, either buy my book or just email me. Okay, next one. So the remarkable thing to me is someone defending that type of experiment and saying, we didn't do it for bad purposes. We're not like the Nazis. We did it to gain information. And they did gain information. You have to decide if it was worth it. Next slide, please. I have a whole appendix on this, by the way, on just awful things. Okay, here is one that I think is really interesting. Nico Tinbergen won the Nobel Prize for work with herring gulls. He found that herring gulls, when they laid eggs, when the hatchlings came out, the mother would pick up the eggshells and deposit the eggshells a long way from the nest. And Tinbergen asked, why do they always do that? If they always do a certain behavior in a certain situation, we should be asking, how is this behavior good for it? And Tinbergen showed the way it's good for it is that, take this off. It's good for it because the eggshells attract predators. And if the eggshells are removed, then the predators can't find them. Well, Richard Dawkins did some fascinating work, and he argued that the behavior might be good for some animal, but not necessarily for the animal that does it. He gives a lot of examples, but I'll give only one, Toxoplasma gondii. It's a parasite, and cats often have this parasite. I'm sorry, rats have this parasite, I mean. And what the parasite does, among other things, is it makes the rat unafraid. So a rat that has this parasite is likely to approach cats. The cat will then eat the rat, kill and eat the rat, and the cat then digests the rat and excretes it. And the next rat comes along and eats the feces or is exposed to the feces, and the cycle starts again. The rat is not scared of the cat. Well, it turns out that people can also be infected with this parasite. If you clean a cat's litter box, for example, there's a very good chance that you'll be infected with the parasite. Next slide, please. We'll hold off on that slide. Let me go back to toxoplasma. It was estimated until very recently that worldwide about 30% of people have this parasite, and they behave differently. Their reaction times are different. They're more likely to have affairs. There are a number of behavioral differences. A study just came out and said that the estimate of 30% is too low. Maybe 50 to 60% of people worldwide have this parasite, and it changes their behavior. So the behavior, the initial question that Tinbergen asked is, how is behavior A good for the animal in situation P? And that's not the best question to ask. The right question is, who is benefiting from this behavior? and it's often not the one that's doing it. Okay, next slide, please.
And I wanted to let you know, Fred, you're about 10 minutes to go until we do any Q&A stuff. So if there was anything you wanted me to forward to or for you to go over, just let me know and I'll get you to the slide.
Oh, gee, you know what? It's hard for me to do. I'll bet there is stuff, but I can't. Well, one thing I'll say, I'm not a physicist, and unfortunately, I used to be good at math. I'm not anymore, and I can't follow quantum physics math. But quantum physics is absolutely fascinating. I've read a lot of popular accounts, and physicists, quantum physicists, tend to agree that the world as we know it is much different from the way it really is. That's all I can say about that for now. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And one example, we'll come back to that infallible lie detector that I talked about earlier. Let's suppose that we test you and your identical twin in infallible lie detector. We have you each in different rooms.
Fred, your voice is a little bit low in volume. You might be covering one of your microphones.
Oh, okay. Is this better?
You're good to go.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Alexandra. So we have twins, and we put them in different rooms, and they're hooked up to an infallible lie detector. And we ask twin in room A, we give them all answers that they give the politically correct answers to. They don't know that the machine is infallible. With twin B is told that the lie detector is infallible, and we ask the same questions, but we get very different answers from A and B. So, for example, we ask, are you racist at all? And the one who does not know that the lie detector is infallible says, I don't have a racist bone in my body. The one who thinks that the lie detector is infallible says, yes, I'm a racist. Okay, next slide. Next slide. I like that quote. Next slide. Here are examples of companies other than drug companies that are being terribly dishonest in very important matters. So again, there's not much time, so you can see what it is, and I give many examples in the book. Okay, next slide. I don't know that we seriously have to talk about politicians lying. Okay, next slide. There are many fake news sites. I'm sure that everyone who's listening to this is aware of that, so I won't say more there. Next slide. I wrote Tom Paxton, and I asked if he would let me include his little song. And the song, of course, is that our government is never wrong. Okay, next slide. I haven't tried the Fakeapp, but some of you probably are aware. It's a very powerful tool that anyone can use. If you want, you can put a porn video, let's say, but put some politician who you don't like right in the middle of it. Apparently, it's easy to do. Okay, next slide. We might think that science is the highest level empiricism. But in fact, there are so many different errors in science. I talked earlier that about John Ioannidis, who argues that more than 50% of articles in the best medical journals draw incorrect conclusions. Okay, next slide. Chaos theory is interesting because let's say you do a study and I do a study, the same basic study. We would think, most scientists think, that even though your study and mine aren't identical, we're in different buildings, the temperature might be a little different and so on. But in fact, it turns out that tiny initial differences may lead to huge differences in outcomes. Next slide, please. Here's an interesting example. In 1999, a 5-year-old boy was in the middle of a big custody battle. I won't go into all the details here. Next slide. The argument is that if that custody battle hadn't been fought in Florida, we would not have had the Gulf War. In the same way, phenomena can't always be predicted just from looking at their constituent parts. We have sodium, the element. We have chlorine, the element. Neither of them looks like salt. But put sodium and chlorine together, do it in the right way, and we get salt. Next slide. Now here is something that I think is really important. We have two syllogisms. Say we have a syllogism. A certain theory predicts that if we arrange conditions in a particular way, we will get a certain outcome. That's what statement 1 says. And suppose we do get that predicted outcome. So we say, I have proven theory T. Is that a valid argument? And then we have the second syllogism that predicts if we have carefully specified conditions, we make a prediction and we fail to get the predicted outcome, we've disproven theory T. Well, which of either of those or both of them do you think is valid? That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. Next slide, please. Only the second syllogism is valid, and that's valid only if we ignore what I talked about earlier about logic. But let's consider the first syllogism. I have a theory or a hypothesis. Unicorns exist, and they exist in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. So I make a prediction. If unicorns exist in Golden Gate Park, then I will find animal droppings if I look in that park. I do find animal droppings. Well, obviously, that doesn't prove that unicorns exist. It's an invalid syllogism. But the fact is that almost all of scientific reasoning is based on the invalid syllogism. And the same is true of everyday reasoning. So scientists develop hypotheses. They make predictions based on those hypotheses. If the predictions come out to be true, they argue that their hypothesis is true. And it's not necessarily. Next slide, please. Okay, let's ignore that slide, go to the next one. And here, maybe this will be my last slide, but it's an important one. There's a big argument for many years between C.I. Lewis and Hans Reichenbach. And I think that Lewis won the day. And my impression is that most philosophers today agree with Lewis, but I'm not sure about that. I don't think it's been resolved to everybody's satisfaction. But what Lewis argues is that unless we know something with certainty, we can't even judge probabilities. Well, I've argued throughout that certainty is beyond our grasp, and that means so is probability. And I realize now, I just said this would be the last slide, but see, you're wrong. You were certain of it and you were wrong. Next slide, please. I give examples in the book. This will be my last slide. I give my examples in the book. You are certain that your close friend is not a serial killer or an Al-Qaeda terrorist or any of those. And yet when such people are caught, they often have neighbors and even close friends who are totally shocked. They just couldn't believe that that was the case. Okay, so I better stop. I'm happy to try to answer questions. I think that on the very last slide, I put my mailing address. So maybe, Alexandra, if you could go to the last slide so people will have it. But again, I'm happy to answer any questions or comments people might have.
I'm bringing your information up so it is at the end of this recording. So hopefully everybody can see that slide.
Okay.
There we go.
And I might add that I wrote a novel called Only Billionaires Can Play that's really based on the philosophy that hero and heroine can never be certain of things. Okay, so the floor is open.
So perfect. And I mean, I always love for my authors to get through everything that they really wanted to talk about, but I love when they don't, because then it's kind of a nice open-ended to say, hey, go read my book. And fantastically enough, our libraries do have a copy of it in circulation. So if people are feeling like they want to take on everything in a little bit more in-depth thought process that you were able to formulate into the book, we have it at the library. So want to throw that in there. You always have to plug circulation for library coming in. Obviously, Fred's going to love you if you buy his book. However, the library will love if you check that said book out at the library.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. If I lived in your area, I'd take you to dinner.
Right, I appreciate that. I think that the biggest question that pretty much two questions that I normally try to ask, but then by the time I'm talking with the author, something else pops up but this time truly, in the end of it, what really inspired you to write this book, to actually get it down? Was it so that future populations read this book and are able to kind of, read another thought process, or, what were you trying to take your reader down through a pathwise for?
Well, partly I'd like for smart people to try to grapple with the problem. I try to grapple with it. I mean, obviously in my day-to-day living, I believe that I do know things. I don't eat wet cement instead of an apple. I came here because I thought certain things would happen. But it's very unsatisfactory because philosophically, I show that we can't know anything. So I'm hoping that I inspire people to think about this, and maybe someone a lot smarter than me will come along and come up with a good answer.
You're leaving a seed of knowledge for the future to ponder on.
There you go. Well said.
What did you learn while writing either this book or the other book that you wrote?
Oh, that writing is hard work. I'm not sure. I do write in part to crystallize my thinking, maybe to lead me to think out of the box. And I'm not sure just how much of that there was, but certainly in part, that's it. That I certainly went in a lot more depth in things that I had just briefly thought about. But when I was writing about them and I thought, well, I better get some references, I learned a lot more.
No,
as one
no,
as
go
one
on.
example. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Continue your thought.
Well, as one example, toward the very end, I talked about your friend or neighbor or whatever being a serial killer. I had no idea what the statistics were like until that example persuaded me to look at the statistics. And they're a little scary, actually. The number of pedophiles who are still loose in this country, the number of serial killers who are loose in this country. It's pretty crazy. So I learned that from reading the book, from writing the book, I mean.
I have a new question that I think I'm going to continue to ask my authors. I was listening to a book via audio because I have a little bit of a commute myself every day to the library. And at the end of it, there was a interview between the author and a set of ladies that do a podcast. And so they asked a question that I was like, you always ask the author the questions about their book, but you never ask them about their reading habits and things of that nature. Well, I don't. And so I'm throwing out there, do you currently have a book that you are reading that you would love to share information about, or that you just recently read a book? It could be fiction or nonfiction, and it's your time to give a reader's advisory to somebody to potentially wet their whistle for something else to read.
Well, one of the things that really bothers me is I'm not as much of a reader as I used to be. I watch way too much, but I am reading a book that I'm really enjoying. It's by Muhammad Hanif, Hanif, and the title is A Case of Exploding Mangoes. I just, on the front cover, they have a blurb from the Washington Post. Insanely brilliant, belongs in a tradition that includes Catch-22, but also calls to mind the biting comedy of Philip Roth, the magical realism of Salman Rushdie, and the feverish nightmares of Kafka. So yeah, that's one. You got me at a good time.
Well, I'm glad. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully we're able to get some further readers for you, and maybe some back and forth of, somebody who watches this in the future and they're able to shoot you an email, and maybe they're able to get some more juices flowing and they have a bigger brain that they want to discuss some of your concepts about.
Well, I'd be delighted to do that. And thanks again, Alexandra. And check out the chimpanzee memory site.
Yes, I'm interested enough to see. I definitely probably am not smarter than a chimp, and after having a baby, I'm pretty sure I lost a lot of brain cells. So it's a transfer, a transition, definitely. But thank you for your time, and I'm going to end the recording right now.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Bye-bye.